The truth about medieval bathhouse. When we think of the Middle Ages, images of dirt, disease, and poor hygiene often come to mind. Popular culture has long portrayed medieval Europeans as grimy, unwashed, and afraid of bathing. But this stereotype doesn't hold up under historical scrutiny. In reality, medieval people valued cleanliness far more than we give them credit for, and public bathhouses played a surprisingly significant role in their daily lives, not just as places for washing, but also as centers for health, socializing, and even romance. Bathing traditions in Europe didn't begin or end with the Middle Ages. They have ancient roots, most famously with the Romans. Roman thermae were vast complexes that featured steam rooms, cold plunges, hot pools, massage tables, and even libraries and gardens. These bathhouses were central to Roman social life and hygiene practices. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, many of its institutions fell into disrepair. But the cultural practice of communal bathing did not disappear. Instead, the habit of regular bathing continued in various forms across medieval Europe, merging with local customs and surviving well into the later Middle Ages. By the early medieval period, public bathhouses were still widespread, especially in places like France, Italy, Germany, and the Byzantine Empire. These bathhouses weren't as grand as Roman ones, but they served a similar purpose. Operated either privately or by municipalities, they were often attached to monasteries or hospitals. Monks, contrary to the stereotype of dirty medieval clergy, maintained a high level of hygiene. Many monasteries had rules requiring regular bathing, sometimes weekly or bi-weekly, as cleanliness was seen as part of spiritual discipline. Urban bathhouses also thrived, particularly in cities. They became popular social hubs where people from various classes could gather. Men and women typically bathed separately, but in certain regions and time periods, mixed bathing was not only common but accepted. In 13th century Paris, for instance, men and women often shared the same bathhouses without scandal. Over time, however, changing moral attitudes, especially with the rise of religious reform, led to increasing criticism of such practices. Medieval bathhouses were generally made of wood or stone, with several different rooms including changing areas, steam rooms, and hot water soaking tubs. Furnaces heated the water, which was often infused with herbs like chamomile, lavender, or rosemary for fragrance and medicinal purposes. The bathhouse experience could be luxurious. Visitors might begin with a light scrub or massage, then move through increasingly warm rooms, followed by a long soak. Food and drink were often available, and it wasn't unusual to hear music or see entertainment while bathing. Vendors sometimes sold beer and wine right inside the bathhouse. Barbers were a regular feature of medieval baths. Their role extended far beyond cutting hair. They also shaved beards, performed minor surgeries such as bloodletting, and even extracted teeth. The iconic red and white barber pole originates from these medical practices, symbolizing the blood and bandages of surgical procedures. A visit to a bathhouse could include a full grooming session, making it a one-stop destination for health, hygiene, and relaxation. However, not all bathhouse activities were strictly innocent. In many towns, especially by the later Middle Ages, bathhouses became associated with prostitution. In Germany, for example, some bathhouses known as Badestebahn operated as both bathing facilities and brothels. Bathhouse attendants sometimes doubled as sex workers, which drew increasing concern from religious authorities who began to see these spaces as immoral. The growing association with vice would eventually contribute to their decline. Despite this, bathhouses remained popular for much of the High Middle Ages. They were used by peasants, merchants, and nobility alike. Cleanliness was not seen as vanity, but rather as a marker of health and respectability. Even contemporary medical theories encouraged bathing. The concept of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated medieval medicine, and bathing was believed to help balance these fluids by cleansing the body and promoting the proper flow of internal energies. But this golden era of medieval bathing came to an abrupt halt due to a combination of health crises, changing religious values, and environmental challenges. The most significant turning point came in the 14th century with the arrival of the Black Death. This devastating pandemic wiped out a third of Europe's population and left people desperate for explanations. With no germ theory, medieval Europeans blamed bad air or miasma for the spread of disease. Bathhouses, with their warm and moist environments, were seen as places that opened the skin pores and made people more susceptible to these toxic airs. Fear spread quickly, and public bathing began to be seen as risky rather than healthy. Religious changes also played a major role. By the late medieval period and into the Reformation era, religious leaders began emphasizing inner purity over outward cleanliness. Protestant reformers in particular promoted stricter moral codes, and the sensual or communal nature of bathhouses made them targets for reform. The connection between bathhouses and prostitution didn't help their reputation. Over time, the practice of public bathing began to fade. Another reason for the decline was practical. Water quality. As urban populations grew, it became harder to maintain clean water supplies. Rivers and wells became contaminated with waste, and people grew wary of public facilities that reused water or lacked proper sanitation. Private washing at home using basins and cloths began to replace the practice of visiting public baths. Full immersion baths became rare and were often reserved for the elite or the seriously ill. Still, not every culture turned away from public bathing. In the Islamic world, the hammam remained an important part of daily and religious life. These beautifully constructed bathhouses continued to flourish, particularly in Moorish Spain and the Ottoman Empire, where hygiene was seen as both a health practice and a religious duty. European travelers who visited these regions were often struck by the contrast with their own declining standards of public cleanliness. By the 17th and 18th centuries, public bathhouses had virtually disappeared from much of Europe. This period is sometimes jokingly referred to as the Great Unwashed, as bathing became infrequent and even discouraged. Royalty and nobles sometimes went months without a proper bath. Queen Elizabeth I famously claimed to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. Instead of bathing, people used perfumes, powders, and wigs to cover body odors. It wasn't until the Enlightenment and the rise of modern science that public health and hygiene began to be prioritized once again. Despite their decline, medieval bathhouses left a lasting legacy. The word spa comes from the town of Spa in Belgium, known for its healing mineral springs. The practice of taking the waters at natural springs or health resorts has ancient and medieval roots. Over time, these traditions evolved into the luxury spas and wellness centers of today. From massage to hydrotherapy, many modern wellness practices can trace their lineage back to medieval and even Roman bathhouse culture. The story of medieval bathhouses challenges our assumptions about the past. Far from being filthy and indifferent to cleanliness, many medieval Europeans took hygiene seriously and incorporated it into their daily lives. Bathhouses were not just for washing, they were spaces for community, conversation, relaxation, and even romance. They were, in a way, the medieval world's version of the coffee shop, health clinic, barbershop, and social club all rolled into one. Their decline was not simply due to ignorance or moral panic, but rather a complex mixture of medical fear, religious reform, environmental decline, and changing social norms. And yet, their influence endures. Every time we enjoy a hot bath, visit a spa, or spend time grooming ourselves, we're continuing a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. So the next time someone jokes that people in the Middle Ages never bathed, remember the truth is far more interesting and a lot cleaner.